Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 29th, 2024. Well, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly met yesterday, and what they decided or what they discussed was why they must allow for missiles to go into Russian territory. The discussion had to do with lifting the restrictions against that. And the general consensus was that they should do it, although the final decision wasn't made. Now, Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has been pushing for this for a while. He said that there's no reason not to allow Ukraine to do that. Well, Putin gave them a reason. He said it would be clear that it's not Ukraine doing this, but NATO. And he said very clearly, quote, they should be aware of what they are playing with. In other words, if NATO authorizes attacks on Russia, it's NATO that will be targeted by Russia in response. Now, the war hawks are provocatively pushing ahead, but they're being outflanked. Let's take a look at some of these developments. In terms of the Ukraine situation, the German government reiterated that there should be no use of no targeting using long-range missiles of Russia. And the Italians joined them, saying that they disagree with that idea also. The foreign minister of Hungary made a very strong statement that NATO must not be allowed to be brought into the war against Russia. Now, the same thing on the Gaza situation. There's a growing attack against the U.S. policy, which is at this point still the NATO policy, of full support for Israel. You have the International Criminal Court and the International Court for Justice issuing rulings against Israel. These are being defied. The ICJ said that Israel must stop the offensive in Gaza. This is being defied with more attacks and more killing by the Israeli Defense Forces. But this is increasing the opposition to Israel and its isolation. In the last days, Spain, Norway, and Ireland all announced they're going to recognize Palestine as an independent state. There are other countries that are lining up to do that as well, including Slovenia. Meanwhile, Germany announced that they would honor the International Criminal Court warrant against Netanyahu. They would arrest him if he does come to Germany. Even the Canadian government, and I don't know if this can be trusted, but the Canadian government called for an end of Israel's attacks on the Palestinian people. And Mexico, our neighbor to the south, announced that they will join the South African case at the International Court for Justice, which charges Israel with a plausible case of genocide. Now, meanwhile, you have a phony peace conference coming up in Switzerland. How can you have a peace conference to settle a war when you don't invite Russia? One more positive proposal towards peace came from a meeting between China and Brazil. They put out a 6-point plan, and the 6th point called for increased international cooperation for economic development, especially on infrastructure, health, science, and tech policies. Now, on this, I have a statement from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which fell to the floor, but Helga has been very clear on the danger. And that's why we put out a red alert statement, which you can find attached again at the description section today. But what Helga said on May 22nd, quote, "We are on the edge of a catastrophe. Any thinking person is flabbergasted, absolutely shocked by the fact that the Western establishments are completely unable to recognize the outcome of their policies. You see that the entire NATO policy towards Russia has not functioned. It backfired. But you do not see any sign of recognition or reflection. If people are so detached from reality as we see right now, you really start to worry about their mental health. And as I pointed out yesterday, we should offer them free treatment at the mental health clinic of their choice." Now, meanwhile, you have many countries turning to the Schiller Institute, both in terms of working with the International Peace Coalition, but also bringing speakers onto their television news stories. Helga has been featured on South African television, and I'll have a link on that in the description section. And also China. I've done interviews in the last 2 days on Russian television and Lebanon, along with my usual number of US interviews. So there's a real interest in what we're saying and what we're doing. Now, on the other side, you have the placeholder Kamala Harris, who sent a letter to the Georgian president supporting her veto of Georgia's law of transparency on foreign influence. The veto was overturned by Parliament. The bill would require any non-governmental organization or media that receives 20% of its income from foreign sources to have to register as acting on behalf of a foreign power. This is a protection. Why should countries be allowed to fund operations inside other countries? But meanwhile, 4 US senators introduced a bill of support for Georgia joining the European Union and NATO. This is a color revolution operation in process. Keep in mind that there was a NATO push to bring Ukraine and Georgia in as members at the famous Bucharest summit in April 2008. And it was pushed then by the Bush administration. It was seen clearly as a provocation against Russia. And the Bush administration, in offering to bring up this question of NATO membership, said, quote, Russia will not have a veto, unquote, over membership of Ukraine and Georgia. Now, before that, a few months before, in January 2008, the then US ambassador to Russia, William Burns, sent a classified cable to Washington. And the message was, "Niet means niet." That is, Russia's no means no. The reason we found out about this cable was it was made public thanks to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Now, this gives you some idea of why Assange is rotting away in a prison in London, awaiting extradition to the United States. Now, Burns then sent a letter to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and he said, quote, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russia's interests. And he called it, quote, needlessly provocative. William Burns is now US CIA director. What did he know then, which he has apparently forgotten? Now, then you had a statement from Robert Gates, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and he included this in his memoirs, which were published in 2014. What Gates said is that bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, quote, was truly overreaching and recklessly ignoring what the Russians considered their own vital national interests, unquote. Well, clearly back then we had some US officials who recognized that Russia did have national interests, and we had to take those into consideration. That's what Putin was asking for from 2008 until 2022, that the West consider the national security interests of Russia before acting against them. And during that entire period of time on NATO expansion, on combating Russian influence in the developing sector, later in carrying out a coup in Ukraine in 2014, they ignored the legitimate security concerns of Putin, and he continued to press them all the way up until February 2022, when he concluded that the West was not interested in his security concerns, nor the security concerns for Ukraine either. And it was at that point that Putin launched the special military operation. Well, what can we do to change US policy? It's going to depend on what you do, because we don't have political leaders who think the way they did even 15, 16, 18 years ago. That the current crowd of political establishment in both parties in the United States and virtually every party in Europe is committed to confrontation with Russia and China and Iran, regardless of how much it costs and how many people die. So it's up to you to become part of an informed opposition. And by opposition, I don't mean sitting at home muttering under your breath whenever you see one of these stooges pop up on television. What I mean is going out publicly and confronting them, confronting congressmen, confronting all political institutions. Will you end this reckless provocation and move toward a policy which is based on peaceful cooperation for mutual benefit? So that's my report for today. Check out the links in the description box, and I'll see you again tomorrow.
The big question, what can we do about it? If we have the power to influence the course of history as individuals, then each of us has a corresponding moral responsibility to muster from within ourselves those capacities which enable us to do our part in shaping the course of civilization. Now, under that rubric, I say, what kind of news is newsworthy? The only news that's worth having is news which performs those functions, which enables government, which enables you as an individual and so forth, better to understand what is happening to this planet, to understand what the developments are that are shaping the course of history, and finally to indicate to you the facts which you need to look at so that you can judge what it is that you might be able to do which can contribute to bringing about a solution, an escape from the collapse of civilization. This is no pipe dream, this is no fantasy, this is real.